Good to have everybody here tonight. As you know, we have been journeying our way through the Psalms, and tonight we're going to stop at the Royal Psalms in here. So, sounds great, right? So, start by asking, I'm going to get you some audience participation here. So, what does it mean to be royal? So, when you hear the word royal, what are the things that pop into your mind? What do you hear? What do you think of? Kings. Okay. What else? Crowns. What's that? Pre- Purple. Purple. Okay. Yep. Diamonds. Hmm. Castles. Power. Privilege. Great. Right. Sovereign. Yep. Anything else, anybody? All right. Well, let's take a look here. So we're going to go ahead and take a look. So our friends at ChatGPT give us this. When you type in royal, what does it mean to be royal? Here it comes. Doesn't quite come across here, but the color, the background here is actually purple, as you mentioned, the color of royalty in here. Kings and queens, for sure. Very specifically, the British kings and queens, the British monarchy comes up, right? I mean, I guess, who doesn't like a good scandal here and there, right? Very famous, though, in there, right? And then the last part, comes into it diamonds, castles, luxury, right? When we think of kings, queens, these big castles, right? Think of opulence, all of those things in there, right? These things are all influenced by what we know of, right? What we think of in here, right? But as we journey back through the Psalms in here about the royal Psalms in particular, right? Uh, they knew that it was more than that. It was more than the money. It was more than the power, the authority. It was more than living in luxury, right? There was just so much more to it than being a figurehead, being a leader in there. So as we go forward here, right, we're going to talk about what it means to be in the royal Psalms in there, right? So they provide insights into kingship, leadership, royalty, right? And specifically, they explore the relationship between the kings and God, right? So what does it mean to rule like a king? What does it mean to lead in that way, right? And what are the blessings for a kingdom that's under the righteous leadership of a king that follows God in there, right? Psalm 72 is going to tell us about that, right? And specifically, we're going to be looking at the first three verses of Psalm 72 in here, and they're going to be talking about wisdom, justice, and righteousness. So join me as we journey into this, right? So it's on the screen here for you, read it for you. So it says, give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to the royal son. May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. Let the mountains bear prosperity for the people and the hills in righteousness. May he defend the cause of the poor of the people, give deliverance to the children of the needy, and crush the oppressor. May they fear you while the sun endures, and as long as the moon, throughout all generations. May he be like rain that falls on the mown grass, like showers that water the earth. In his days may the righteous flourish and peace abound, till the moon be no more. So this psalm right here is one of two psalms that are attributed to King Solomon. So as mentioned, most of them are written by David or attributed to David. There's some with Moses. This is one of the two of them attributed to his son, King Solomon, in there, right? So a bit of background on King Solomon in here. So he was born of David, King David and Bathsheba, so he was their son, born in Jerusalem, right? Born at the height of prosperity for Israel, right? And he's known for a couple of things, right? He's known for his wisdom, his his wealth, and his building projects. Take it back one, please. Oh, other way. Oh, I'm missing it, right? But it was going to be the building projects, specifically the first temple of Jerusalem, which this is right here, which his father David wanted to build, and God told him he wasn't allowed to do it. So his son actually built that in there. But to give us a little bit of insight into King Solomon, I'm going to take you back to the very beginning of this, and this is going to be relevant because as we're looking at what this psalm has to tell us, it's important to know who he was and what he kind of ruler he was. So we're going to go back to 1 Kings chapter 3, and in there at the beginning it says, "At Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, 'Ask for whatever you want me to give you.'" It's a pretty amazing thing, right? God says, "Hey, ask for it and I'm going to give it to you. Ask for whatever you want in there." And then a little bit later on in verses 9 through 12, this is how Solomon answers him. So this is Solomon speaking. He says, "So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. So God said to him, "Since you have asked for this, and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment and administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be." Right? I think that's really important for us to know that background as we look at this, because it tells us what kind of ruler Solomon was at the beginning of his life. Right? He was looking to lead with wisdom, and not just his wisdom, but the wisdom that came from God in there. And so, with that, right, we're going to look at this and say, what uh, what comes in here, right? Wisdom. Leadership requires divine wisdom. Solomon knew that, right off the bat. What did he do? He asked for wisdom in there, right? And we knew that because he looked at this and he said, "Hey, it's more than just the power and authority. I have the power. I have the authority, right? My father was David. I'm now the king. But I can't just rule with that, right? It takes more than that, right?" And if we think about the people that in our lives that have authority and power in there, right? It could be the boss, could be the CEO of your company, could be a teacher in a classroom, right? These people all have power. As parents, we have power, right? In there. But this psalmist knew that it was going to take more than just that, right? In fact, the first two verses tell us, right? It says, "Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to the royal son. May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice." Right? So they knew that wisdom was going to take more than that, right? Leading was going to take more than just that, right? What does this look like? Well, fortunately, there's a couple of examples I've got for you. One about leading without, and one about leading with this kind of godly wisdom that we look for, right? So we talk about leading without. I'm going to take you back to King Saul. So this is David's, the predecessor of David in here. Now, if you go all the way back to 1 Kings chapter 15, he's in war, and God gives him a command, and he chooses to disobey it in there. He chooses not to do what God has asked him to do. And then a little bit later on, we get to chapter 28, 1 Kings chapter 28, and this is what it looks like to lead without. We find Saul getting ready to battle the Philistines, working in there, and he's trying to inquire of God, and God's not answering him. So what does he do? He goes off and finds a medium. Medium being someone that was thought to be able to talk to the dead, conjure up in there, and he goes and finds them. Problem is, he had banished them all from the kingdom, so they were hiding and they were afraid for their lives. So he's got to disguise himself, and he goes and finds one of the mediums and inquires of her to speak to the prophet Samuel, who's no longer here, right? The same Samuel that had anointed Saul as king back in the day, right? And he even goes so far as to say that the Lord will not punish this medium for doing this in here. So he's seeking guidance from a place that's not God, right? In fact, she does pull up Samuel, and Samuel answers him and says, in verses 16 through 19, it says, "And Samuel said, 'Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done as to you as he spoke by me. For the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor, David, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce anger, his fierce wrath against Amalek. Therefore, the Lord has done this thing to you. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. The Lord will give the army of Israel also into the hands of the Philistines.'" When we lead without God's wisdom, right, bad things happen in there. Not only to him, but look what happens to him at the end here. The army of Israel is going to be given into the hands of the Philistines, right? It's about more than just you. When you have leadership and you have that kind of responsibility, it is about more than you. And when you choose to follow someone other than God, it's ultimately going to cause problems. In this case, it caused Saul his downfall, right? He was going to lose his kingdom, and it was going to be gone. And it was not even going to go to his family, right? It was going to go to David next, right? So when we lead without, right, bad things happen not only to us, but to the people around us. But when we lead with, right, that wisdom follows in there, right? So we talk about King Solomon, story from King Solomon, fairly early in his reign, and here it goes like this: that there were two women who gave birth not too long apart, a few days apart. In fact, they were together in here. And one night, one of the women's babies died in the middle of the night. And so she got up and she swapped that baby with the ladies next to her and took her baby back. They woke up the next day, and then there was a disagreement over whose baby this was. And King Solomon, being the king, one of his jobs was to just settle these disputes. And so they brought them to him, and they asked, "What should we do?" Right? How do you fix it? How do you determine who this is? Right? This is before we've got DNA and all these other ways that we can do today to figure this stuff out. Right? So what do you do? Well, King Solomon said, "Oh, you know what? I know. Come here. Bring the baby right here. We'll just cut it in half and we'll give half to each." Right? But here's the thing. The true mother stopped and she said, "No, please, don't do that. I give the baby to her. She can have him. I don't want anything to happen to this child." King Solomon looked at her and said, "Truly I know you are the mother because of the way that you have behaved, because your instinct was to protect this child. I know that it's yours." Right? And we can see that Solomon had judgment, discerning judgment, insight into human nature, but it didn't come from him, right? We talked about earlier about how he had wisdom. He had asked God for wisdom. It came from God, right? And in fact, Scripture tells us after that story, it says, "And all Israel heard the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king because they perceived the wisdom of God was in him to do justice." Did you catch that? The wisdom of God was in him to do justice. Right? There is a big difference about leading without and leading with godly wisdom. Right? As leaders, we must choose to lead with. Right? And as people, right, we have to look for people that are going to lead with. Because I don't know about you, but I want to follow the guy that's following God, not the guy that's going to lead an army that's going to get taken over, right? In there. So, leading, so as we conclude this section here, right? Leading with divine wisdom requires us to seek God's understanding, right? It requires us to look for his divine wisdom with what we're doing in there, right? Doesn't mean we're always going to do it perfectly, because we're not. Here's the thing. Even Solomon, eventually his sin caught up to him, and his kingdom was split apart because of that. But at least at the start of this, he was looking to lead with that godly wisdom that's required in there. So that's the first part of this psalm that we're going to look at tonight, right? The second part, we're going to be looking at justice, right? We're protecting the vulnerable, right? We go back into there and we look at this. The responsibility of the king, or any leader really, it's to defend those that can't defend themselves, right? In verses 4-5 here, it says, may he defend the cause of the poor of the people, give deliverance to the children of the needy, and crush the oppressor. May they fear you while the sun endures and as long as the moon throughout all generations. Right? Justice, it's a big part, a big pillar of leading, of kingly leading, right? Of leading like a king in here. Right? And it's not just about us, it's about the vulnerable society as we go into there, right? So we talk about this, right? We're going to talk about this man right here. Those of you that don't know him, this gentleman's name is William Wilberforce. So you're not going to find him in your Bible, but you're going to find him in your history books. He lived in the late 1700s, early 1800s in here, and he was a British politician. And as you can see right here in the background in here, slavery was prevalent in the British Empire at that point in time. He spent his life fighting for the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. Why did he do that? Because he's a good guy? Yeah, partially. He was also inspired by his faith in God, in Jesus, to do the right thing in there. So his faith played a major role in what he did and why he did that, right? So, thing is, like everybody else, there's lots of people that didn't want what this guy was doing in here, right? You got people that were trading the slaves, owned the slaves, they shipped the slaves. What do they stand to lose? All that money, right? They're making money hand over fist doing this in here. Politicians, other politicians that he was working with, that were afraid that they stopped trading slaves, it was going to hurt the British Empire. And they were comfortable with the status quo. They didn't want to upset the apple cart, right? And as much as it pains me to say, there were people there that were actually pro-slavery. They thought this was a good thing that we have slaves in here. All of those people were coalescing, and they would fight against him and against his efforts in there. But because of his perseverance, he was able to 2 laws passed, one in 1807 and one in 1833. So the Slave Trade Act of 1807 and the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. That one actually stopped the slave trade in the British Empire in there. Think about that. 26 years between those 2 laws that were passed, right? You got to imagine he was working on that first one before that, right? So probably 30 some odd years in there. I don't know about you. I've never worked on anything for 30 years, right? That singular focus in there. But he did, right? And if we look at it, right, he was there as long as the sun endured, as the psalmist would say, right? As long as the moon. He persevered through that. He persevered through all those people that didn't want him to stop this. And he did what was right. He gave justice to those folks that couldn't fight for themselves in there. And the reason is because of his faith. Right? He led with his faith. He led because God told him to in there. Right? So, kind of as we look at that, right? As we consider the justice that leaders, right? We're challenged to advocate for those that can't, right? As we wrap up this, right? We're going to look at this, right? We're challenged to stand up and protect the vulnerable in our society that can't do it on their own. As leaders, that is the challenge. That is what the psalmist tells us to do in there, right? And that's the values of a righteous king, right? You may not all be government leaders who can pass laws to do this stuff, but we all live in communities where there's people that are hurting, people that maybe can't fight for themselves, right? We need to stand up for them, just as William Wilberforce did, right? And then as we move forward, there's a third part of this psalm. We look at righteousness, right? They bring prosperity, right? And I don't want to say prosperity is in gospel, as in you're going to get everything you want, right? But it's going to be about a kingdom where righteousness flourishes and peace abounds when we have leaders that are righteous, right? When we say righteous, we mean that they're aligning with God, right? That they're following his leadership in there. So it's important, right? It's important for society to flourish, right? And in fact, it says back in there, it says, may he be like rain that falls on the mown grass, like showers that water the earth. In his days, may the righteous flourish and peace abound till the moon be no more, right? It's so important for society that we are there, right? To bring prosperity, for it to flourish, bring stability, right? But there is a personal and a societal element to this, right? We have the personal righteousness. We have to be righteous to follow God and to do the things he wants to do. And then we have to lead change in our societies in there. So for this, we're going to go back and look. You see the scroll up here? We're going to go back to the story of King Josiah in here, right? Amazing story. Became king at the age of 8, ruled for 31 years, was preceded and followed by wicked kings, right? People that were doing things were bad. In fact, it was so bad beforehand that the temple, right, the temple I showed you earlier from Solomon, was in disrepair, right? They had to repair it. They had to repair it in there, right? And in fact, it tells us that the king that ruled for much of the 60 years preceding King Josiah, his name was Manasseh. He provoked the Lord to anger. He led the people astray. And the Lord said that he would bring disaster upon Jerusalem and Judah, the likes of which haven't been seen before, right? He was going to bring things down upon them because of their disobedience in there. But thankfully, King Josiah became the king, and he ruled with righteousness and sparked a revival in there, right? Mentioned the scroll up here. In 2 Kings chapter 22, what we find is that they're repairing the temple, and his high priest finds the scroll, the book of the law, in there. And he brings that to King Josiah, and he reads it for him. Would have been real easy for King Josiah to put it back. Say, yeah, we didn't see that. You can go put that thing back in there. All the people before him did. In fact, the people after him were going to do the same thing in there. He didn't. He heard those words. He tore his clothes. He said, "Oh, the Lord's anger burns with us because of all the evil that we have done." And then he said, Go inquire of the Lord what we should do in here." He didn't seek his own guidance, right? He didn't seek his own wisdom about what to do. He said, "Go seek God's wisdom. Go tell me what God would have us do because of our sin. Not just my sin, but because of me and all the people that came before me, all these things that we've done in there, right? It would have been really easy for him to ignore that because it's hard work to turn from our ways when we've made mistakes. He didn't. He sparked a revival in there and went throughout the land, led to reforms, and it led them to return to worshiping God in there. In fact, earlier in that chapter, 2 Kings 22, it says, Josiah did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and followed completely the ways of his father David, not turning aside to the right or to the left. Right? You catch that? He did what was right in there. Not what was easy, what was right in there. Right? He's praised for his commitment and to righteousness, his efforts to reform the nation. Right? And then a little bit later on, Scripture tells us, neither before nor after Josiah was there a king like him who turned to the Lord as he did, with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his strength, in accordance with all the law of Moses. Right? I told you, when we lead with righteousness and follow God, we're going to find peace, right? We're going to find stability in there. That's exactly what happened during Josiah's reign. It was a brief period of time, those 31 years that he reigned, there was peace in the land, right? They were following God in there. That disaster that we told you about that was coming, that God promised earlier, it was still coming, but it was coming later because those kings were not going to follow. They weren't going to bring that righteousness and alignment to God that King Josiah did in there. And so we're reminded about the standards that rulers are called to govern with, right? And the impact that their righteous leadership has on the people. So think about that, right? As we look for the people that lead us, lead our country, we need people that are righteous, that are looking to lead the way that God would have us lead in here. So, yeah, I think this is great, right? We've got 3 stories, and we've got 3 different ways that this psalmist tells us about how kings are to lead, right? And tells us how we're to lead in here. But here's the thing, right? We still haven't talked about this. The King of Kings is here, right? He, as you can imagine, embodied all these things plus a whole lot more in there, right? But these 3 things that I've outlined for you, these 3 pieces in here, he did. And so we're going to talk just briefly about 3 stories, how he did this, right? So all of God's word points back to Jesus. We're going to point back to Jesus here near the end here. We're going to start by looking at wisdom, right? How he led with wisdom, how he showed wisdom. We're going to go into John chapter 8, which recounts the story of a woman caught in adultery, right? By law, she could be stoned to death. You don't believe me? Go look up Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10. It's there, right? But when confronted with this situation, which is very difficult in here, right? How does Jesus respond with wisdom? Right? He turns around, he looks at them, he looks at the accusers and talks about their sin, helps them to see that, right? He says, let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. Right? He was calling out their hypocrisy, right? Hey, let me kill you for your sin, but I don't need to deal with my sin. I don't need to look at my sin. Both separate us from God in there, right? All the accusers left in there. But here's the thing. His wisdom didn't just stop there, right? Stop with how he judged in there, right? Because he didn't just let the woman go and say, yeah, yep, they can't accuse you, so you go do your thing, right? No, no. He tells the woman to go and sin no more, right? He's imparting that wisdom to her. Hey, change. You've got to change your life in there, right? He led with wisdom. He showed wisdom in that situation when everybody else wanted death in there. Talk about justice, right? We're going to go back to Matthew chapter 21, right? Right at the start of the Passover. Everybody's coming to town into Jerusalem. And they're going to go into the temple to give tributes, to make sacrifices, right? Here's the thing. There's money changers there. Don't know how many of you know this, right? But most of the money that people had was Roman. Why? Because they were under Roman rule, right? Here's the thing. To do those tributes, you had to give it in shekels, right? Which required me to change my Roman money into that which could be given. So I bring my money. Here you go. They're not doing that for free. No. They're charging me, right? Hey, yeah, that's great. Yeah, we're gonna take 10% of that back as our money, right? So they're making money hand over fist, right? They're making money in the temple in here, right? You know, we got Iggy, our CEO here, right? In the suit. He's got all the money. That 10% doesn't mean much to him, right? But we've got someone working at McDonald's, barely making rent. That 10%, real big deal, right? So Jesus knew that. He knew this systemically. This wasn't right. These people just wanted to offer their tributes to God. They wanted to give what was right to God, and yet they're being called on it, right? They're being taken advantage of because of that, because they're held hostage essentially, right in there. So Jesus flips the table. He drives them out of there, right? And he restores the temple back to its intended purpose. It's a house of worship, right? He brings them back to where it's supposed to be in there, right? He challenged the justices, the systemic injustices that were occurring, and provide justice for those who were seeking God in there, right? Protecting the vulnerable. They couldn't do it on their own, right? You think that someone that's poor walking in there is going to be able to go in there and drive those money changers out? It's not happening. It required him to show leadership in there and to bring that in there. Right? The third point that we talk about here, we talk about righteousness, right? What does it look like in here? We all know Jesus led with righteousness. Jesus lived a life that was righteous and aligned with God in every single aspect of his life, right? But he taught us what it would look like if we lived with righteousness in there. And for this, we're going to go back to the Sermon on the Mount, and then we're going to highlight two verses for you that talk about righteousness, right? So Matthew 5, chapter 5, verse 6. He says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." Right? You know what it's like to be satisfied in there? When you hunger and thirst for righteousness, hunger and thirst for doing what is right, when you hunger and thirst for what's aligning to God, you will be satisfied in there, right? You know, kind of like we get hungry, right? We get hungry, thirsty, right? You wake up in the day, maybe you haven't eaten all day, right? You get to dinner, your hunger is there. You eat that dinner and you are satisfied, right? When we hunger and thirst to do what is right, to align with God, right? We will be satisfied in there, right? And then just a little bit later in verses 10 through 12, it says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecute the prophets who were before you." Right? Do you catch that? You're persecuted for righteousness' sake. There's just the kingdom of heaven. So what do you get in there? You get the kingdom of heaven. But nobody likes to be persecuted. It's not easy. It's not even fun, right? And in fact, it's a little bit different than Jesus' day, right? Where I had to walk to, I had to see you, I had to go to you to do that, right? Today with the internet, it can happen anywhere, right? We can persecute you from across the globe in there. I mean, just recently I came across a story about a woman from the U.S. women's national soccer team that shared a testimonial of someone that was struggling with their identity and how God was working in their lives in there. Well, that didn't sit real well with someone who was retired now, but a former superstar for that team and the spokesperson for it. And she came out and just flamed this young lady. Within 24 hours, that post was gone, apology was issued, right? And she did nothing more than share something that God was doing in her. I say that not to say I would have done it different. I don't know, right? When the pressures are coming down on you, I don't know if it's any different. But I know that she was persecuted for that. She went through the ringer in there. Hers is the kingdom of heaven, right? Are you ready for that? Are you ready when someone wants to tell you to stop talking about Jesus? They want to persecute you because you stand up for something different. Yours is the kingdom of heaven in there. And these are just a few of the examples from the King of Kings. Like I said, I could probably go on forever talking about how he embodies all of this and so much more, right? But it shows us a little bit about how he led with wisdom, justice, and righteousness in here. So as we conclude here, what I'm going to tell you is that we all lead, right? Earlier I said leading like the king, like a king. Now it's leading like the King of Kings, right? Leading like Jesus in here, right? We're all leaders in some fashion, like I said earlier, right? Maybe you're a parent, right? You're leading your family. You're a boss. You're leading a church. Maybe you're leading a project at school or on your team in there, right? We all lead. And we can take wisdom from this psalm about how we should lead in there. And no matter what we do, right, the royal psalms show us that we need to lead with godly wisdom. We need to lead with wisdom, with justice, with righteousness. And we need to seek leaders. They're going to lead with that. They're going to align with God and follow that blueprint that he's laid out in there. So, I say, let's lead like that.